Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life. My parents bought the house before I was even born, and for the most part it's been quiet. Normal. Just a regular suburban street with sidewalks that crack in the summer heat and trees that drop too many leaves in the fall. The kind of place where you expect kids to ride bikes in circles until the streetlights come on. But the house next door, the one that should have just been another anonymous family home, turned into the source of almost every ounce of tension I can remember. The neighbors there were unlike anyone I've ever met. And when I say terrible, I don't mean the usual kind of petty irritation, like someone who leaves their garbage can out too long or lets their grass get a little high. I mean the kind of people who make you feel trapped in your own home, who make the walls between houses feel paper thin. It all really started with the morning honking. I can't even put into words how much I grew to dread that sound. At 6:30 every single morning, without fail, the neighbor, the wife, would go out to her car, sit there, and lean on the horn until her kids came running out. It wasn't just one short honk. It was long blasts, sometimes 10, 15 seconds at a time, echoing down the street while the rest of us tried to cling to the last hour of sleep before work or school. It would rattle the windows in my room. Some mornings, it would jolt me awake so hard my heart would be racing like I'd had a nightmare. And it wasn't just once. She'd do it every single day, as if she got some kind of satisfaction out of holding the neighborhood hostage to her routine. The worst part was how unnecessary it was. The kids weren't toddlers. They were old enough to walk outside at the sound of her engine starting, or the door shutting, or even the sound of her voice. But she never even tried. She just blasted that horn like it was her personal alarm clock for the whole block. For a while, my parents just put up with it. What else could they do? Nobody really wanted to start a fight. But after a few years, my mom finally cracked. She walked over there one morning, right after the horn had been blaring for a solid minute, and asked politely if maybe they could find another way. That was all she said, polite, measured. But that's when everything went downhill. Because the answer was no. Not just no, but a hard, aggressive no. And then it got worse. Instead of letting it go, they turned it into some kind of twisted neighborhood game. Every single time they left the driveway, whether it was for work or errands, or just backing out for a minute, they leaned on their horns. Multiple times. Quick, angry blasts, drawn-out blares, sometimes a whole chorus of honks like they were celebrating some private joke. It became constant. The noise wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a weapon. I started to feel it in my chest, like a tension that never left. You'd be sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast, and suddenly it would come again. The sound of them pulling out of the driveway and laying into the horn just to remind you they could. I'd clench my teeth, my shoulders tight, and watch my mom shake her head, trying not to let it get to her. But it did. It got to all of us. That would have been enough on its own to make living next to them unbearable. But the honking was just the beginning. The garden was next. My parents have had that garden since they moved in. 25 years of planting tomatoes, peppers, beans, rows of flowers, and herbs in the back corner of the yard. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a rectangle of earth my mom tended every spring and summer. It was her pride, something that made the yard feel alive. But the neighbors suddenly decided it was a problem. One day, out of nowhere, they accused my parents of planting it on their property. They said the garden wasn't ours at all, that it was intruding into their land. We all thought it was ridiculous. The garden had been in the same place forever. But they weren't joking. They hired a land surveyor to come out and draw the exact line between the two yards. When the results came back, we were shocked. Not because we'd done anything wrong, but because the difference was so small it almost didn't feel real. The garden stretched about 4 inches over the line. 4 inches of dirt. That was it. But to the woman next door, it was like we'd stolen her birthright. The next morning, there was a bright orange spray-painted line stretching down the property, splitting the yards like a border between countries at war. Not a subtle line either. Neon orange, thick, impossible to miss. It ran right through the grass, over the dirt, cutting off the corner of the garden. And then she went further. She dug up the section of the garden that crossed the line, yanked out plants, tore into the soil, destroyed it as if it had been some personal insult to her existence. Then came the fence. A little makeshift barrier, uneven and cheap looking, but standing tall enough to say, "This is mine, don't cross." She put her trash bins right behind it, right where our yard met hers, in the most inconvenient, awkward corner. Big, stinking plastic bins shoved up against the line like some kind of trophy. What made it worse was that none of it should have been allowed. The neighborhood has a civic association, and there are rules. No fences without approval. No big changes without votes. But she didn't care. She didn't even try to hide it. The trash bins sat there in the sun, flies buzzing, the smell drifting into our yard whenever the wind shifted. And every time you looked out back, the spray-painted line screamed in your face. It didn't stop there either. She accused my parents of putting dog shit in her yard. The thing is, my parents don't even own a dog. But she had 3 wiener dogs. They barked constantly, their nails clicking on the driveway when they ran loose, their tiny bodies darting around without ever being walked. We all knew where the mess was coming from, but she wouldn't hear it. One afternoon, she stormed across the property line, pounding on the door, screaming at my mom that she was throwing dog shit over the fence. My dad answered that time. He stood there while she ranted and raved, her words spilling over each other, making less and less sense the longer she went on. She accused my mom of plotting against them, of sabotaging their house, of somehow scheming to ruin their lives. She seemed paranoid, her eyes wild, her voice shrill and shaking. My dad tried to stay calm, tried to defuse it, but she wouldn't listen. She stomped back across the line, muttering under her breath, slamming her door so hard it rattled the siding. After that day, I started to feel like I was living in a pressure cooker. You couldn't relax in your own home. You'd wake up to the honking, you'd step outside to see the spray-painted line and the trash bins, you'd hear the dogs yapping. And behind it all was the knowledge that at any moment, she might come storming across again with another accusation, another burst of chaos. It wasn't just noise and inconvenience anymore. It was psychological. I'd catch myself staring at the blinds, listening for car doors, holding my breath when the honking started. My mom looked tired all the time, her shoulders sagging under the weight of it. My dad stayed calm on the surface, but I'd see his jaw clench, his hands curl into fists when the noise started up again. Years have gone by now, and nothing has really changed. The honking still happens. The orange line is long gone, faded and washed away, but the memory of it hasn't faded for me. The trash bins still sit in that corner, and every time I see them I feel that same rush of anger. But here's the thing, somewhere along the way we stopped reacting. At first we fought it in our own ways, complaints, frustration, talking about it endlessly. But after enough years, it became clear that there was no winning. They weren't going to change, no matter what anyone did. They thrived on the fight. They wanted us miserable. And the only way to beat people like that is not to play their game. So now, when the horn blares in the morning, I don't jump out of bed anymore. I roll over, bury my head in the pillow, and let it pass. When I see the bins, I look the other way. When the dogs bark, I put on headphones. Because here's the truth. They can make noise, they can draw lines, they can scream and accuse and stomp. But at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to live with themselves. We don't. And that realization has been freeing in a way I didn't expect. They're still terrible neighbors. Maybe the worst anyone could ask for. But they don't get to own my peace anymore. I refuse to give them that power. And when I walk out into our yard now, I look past their fence, past their trash bins, past their noise, and focus on what's ours. Our house. Our garden rebuilt. Our space. It's not perfect. It never will be. But it's enough. When my mother and I moved into that apartment, it felt like one of the best places we had lived in. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, the rent was affordable, and the building felt safe. We had been there for 2 years without a single problem. The neighbors were polite enough, some friendlier than others, and even though the walls were thin, we never had issues with noise. My mother and I were always careful not to disturb anyone. We never played loud music, never had wild parties, and we always tried to keep our TV at a level where only we could hear it. My mother was the type of person who hated any kind of conflict, and she raised me with the same mindset, to always be considerate, especially when living so close to other people. For 2 years, everything was normal. Quiet evenings, peaceful mornings, the usual sounds of life in the building, distant footsteps, a door shutting here and there, maybe someone cooking or vacuuming, but nothing that ever felt intrusive. I could focus on my own life without feeling like the lives of others were spilling into mine. That changed the day a new family moved into the apartment below us. I remember it clearly. There were so many of them, carrying boxes and bags, kids running up and down the sidewalk while the adults yelled back and forth at each other. They looked like a family of 7, maybe more, all crammed into that one unit. I thought it was just the chaos of moving day, the usual mess of trying to settle into a new place. I told myself it would calm down after a day or two, but it didn't. In fact, it only got worse. The first night they were there, we could already tell this was going to be different from any neighbors we'd had before. The television downstairs was so loud we could make out every single word of whatever movie they were watching. Not muffled sounds, not vague background noise, but word for word, line for line, as if we were sitting right there in their living room. It was unreal. At first, I thought maybe they just hadn't unpacked yet and didn't realize how thin the walls were, but night after night it continued. The bass from their music rattled our floor, the dialogue from their movies echoed through our apartment, and it always went late into the night. Sometimes 3 in the morning, sometimes all the way until the sun came up. It became unbearable. I don't think I've ever experienced noise like that before. It wasn't just that they were loud, it was constant. They would put a DVD on and fall asleep with it playing, but instead of the movie stopping when it was done, it would go back to the menu screen, where the preview clips of the movie played on a loop. Over and over again, the same music, the same sounds, repeating endlessly. I would be lying in bed at 5 in the morning, my eyes burning from exhaustion, and that DVD menu music would be echoing through the floorboards, like some kind of cruel joke that refused to end. My mother tried to pretend it didn't bother her, but I could see it wearing her down. She's a kind person, maybe too kind for her own good. She never wanted to cause trouble or complain, so she just tried to deal with it, hoping they would eventually calm down. But they didn't. If anything, they got worse, like they had no idea other people existed in the building. I started to feel like we were the only ones who noticed, which was impossible, because there were 12 apartments in that building, and the noise was so loud it had to travel far beyond our walls. After about a month of this, I had to go down to the office to pick up a package. The woman at the desk greeted me the way she always did, but this time she asked me something that caught me off guard. She leaned forward a little and asked if I had been having any problems with the neighbors below us. For a moment, I almost laughed, because I thought she was finally going to acknowledge the nightmare we had been living with. I thought maybe someone had finally reported them, maybe more than one person, and management was about to do something about it. But when I told her no, trying to be polite and not immediately throw them under the bus, she said something that froze me in place. She told me the family downstairs had actually complained about us. Us. According to them, we were the noisy ones. She said they mentioned hearing loud bangs, things hitting the floor, as if we were dropping heavy objects. I couldn't believe it. The only thing I could think of was the bag of ice we bought every week. We would drop it on the kitchen floor a couple of times to break it up before putting it in the freezer. That was it. Maybe 2 bangs that lasted a total of 5 seconds once a week. Meanwhile, they had their TV and music blasting until sunrise almost every night, and somehow we were the problem? I explained this to the woman at the desk, but she just looked at me like she didn't believe a word of it. She said no other neighbors had complained about them, so she had no reason to think they were the loud ones. I was stunned. Walking back upstairs, I kept asking myself how it was possible that nobody else had said anything. 12 apartments in that building. 12. And every single night the walls shook from their noise. Was everyone else really just ignoring it? Or had they all decided to stay silent like my mother, too afraid of conflict to speak up? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. It was like reality had twisted, like my mother and I were the only ones who could hear it, trapped in this endless cycle of noise that nobody else would acknowledge. That night, my mother had been waiting to watch a show she had been looking forward to for weeks. She made dinner early, set everything up, and for a moment it felt like we might actually have a normal evening. But right before her show started, the music downstairs kicked on again, louder than ever. It shook the walls, swallowed the sound of our TV, drowned out every word she was waiting to hear. I watched her face crumble. She tried to hold it together, but eventually she broke down and cried. Seeing her like that was the moment I snapped. I couldn't sit there anymore, pretending it was fine. I went downstairs and knocked on their door. The music was so loud I couldn't even hear my own fist hitting the wood. I knocked harder, and still nothing. Either they couldn't hear me, or they were choosing not to answer. Standing in that hallway, the sound was even worse. It echoed through the walls and ceiling, vibrating in the air until I felt it in my chest. It was unbearable. I went back upstairs, furious, and told my mother we had to call the police. When I explained the situation to the dispatcher, she said it could take an hour since it wasn't an emergency. Fine, I thought. At least someone official would come and hear it for themselves. But half an hour later, right before the police arrived, the noise suddenly stopped. Dead silent. For the first time in hours, the apartment below us was quiet. When the police showed up, there was nothing to hear. They left, probably thinking we were exaggerating or wasting their time. The next time it happened, I called again. I don't even know if the call was taken seriously. Maybe they had marked our address as a nuisance call by then. It felt like we were trapped in this insane cycle, reporting, being dismissed, suffering through endless nights of noise while the people responsible faced no consequences. 2 weeks later, the strangest thing happened. There was a knock on our door one evening while the music downstairs was blasting again. I thought it was going to be someone coming to complain, convinced the noise was coming from us. I opened the door expecting an argument, but instead I found 2 neighbors standing there with papers in their hands. They were going door to door, asking everyone in the building to sign a petition to have the family below us removed. I nearly grabbed the pen out of their hands. I signed that paper faster than I've ever signed anything in my life. Finally, proof that we weren't crazy. Proof that other people heard it too, that it wasn't just us. A month later, they were gone. Evicted. The day they left was one of the happiest moments I can remember. I watched from the window as they carried their things out, the same loud chaos they brought with them the day they moved in. For the first time in months, our building was quiet again. The walls stopped shaking, the nights became peaceful, and my mother could finally watch her shows without tears in her eyes. Looking back, I never thought I would feel relief watching a family lose their home. But that's exactly what I felt. Relief. Pure relief. Living above them had been like living in a nightmare that nobody else would admit was real. And when they were finally gone, it was as if the entire building could breathe again. I remember that day so clearly, every second of it burned into my mind. I had just finished work, nothing unusual about it, and I was walking back toward my apartment. The air was heavy that evening, cloudy and humid, the kind of weather that makes the streetlights look hazy when they flicker on early. I had groceries in one hand, my bag slung over my shoulder, moving along the same street I walked almost every day. It was a route I knew by heart, past the small shops, the same parked cars, the faint smell of food from the restaurant near the corner. As I got closer to my building, something caught my eye that made me slow down. At first I thought it was just water running down the gutter, but the color didn't look right. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't the brownish runoff you sometimes see after rain. It was red. A thin line of red was trickling down the pavement, flowing toward the street. It wasn't rushing, but it was steady, and as soon as I noticed it, my body tensed. I stopped walking for a second, staring at it, trying to understand. My mind went through the possibilities, maybe paint, maybe some spilled drink. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't paint. The color was too rich, too dark, and the way it moved was thick, heavy, not watery. I looked around, my eyes following the line of red backward, trying to see where it was coming from. That's when I saw it wasn't coming from the gutter at all. It was running down from the staircase of my building. I froze. My heart started beating hard, and I could feel it in my chest and my throat. I took a few careful steps closer, squinting up at the stairs. There it was, plain as day, blood, smeared on the concrete steps, dripping from the edges, pooling on each step before spilling down to the next. I could smell it then, faint but sharp, metallic like iron. That smell told me the truth more than anything else. My hands felt clammy, the grocery bag digging into my fingers. I knew I should probably call someone, maybe the police, maybe anyone, but my legs kept moving forward on their own. I climbed one step, then another. The sight became worse the higher I went. The stairwell walls were streaked and spattered, big dark stains on the plaster, fresh enough that it still glistened under the hallway light. Drops and splashes reached up to the ceiling. It looked like something had exploded in there, but it wasn't random. There were patterns, like someone had swung something heavy again and again, spraying blood across the narrow stairwell. My stomach turned, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to look too closely at the dark chunks stuck to the wall. I kept climbing slow, cautious, my ears straining for any sound. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Normally in the evenings, I'd hear the muffled sound of a TV from one apartment, or someone talking on the phone through the thin doors, or even footsteps above. But that night, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, rough and shallow, and the faint sticky drip of liquid hitting the steps. When I reached the landing where my apartment was, my heart nearly stopped. My front door was smeared with it too. The entire surface was covered in blood, handprints, streaks, smudges, as if someone had stumbled against it or been pressed against it. The handle itself was wet with it, dark and sticky. I stood there staring, my whole body rigid, my mind spinning with panic. I reached out, hesitated, then pulled my hand back. I didn't want to touch it. I dug my keys out with shaking fingers, tried to fit them into the lock, but my hand was trembling so badly I dropped them. They clattered against the stained floor, the sound far too loud in the silence. I crouched quickly, snatched them up, tried again. The lock didn't turn. My door was locked from the inside. For a few seconds I just stood there, staring at it, confused and terrified. My brain kept saying, "This is my apartment, my home. Why is it locked? Where is my wife?" My pulse was hammering. I pressed my face closer, and that's when I saw a faint movement. The letterbox slot opened slowly, just a crack. I saw an eye. My wife's eye, wide and full of fear, peeking through. Before I could say anything, she snapped it shut, and the lock rattled. The door opened just enough for her hand to grab my arm, yanking me inside with a sudden force I wasn't expecting. The door slammed shut behind me, the deadbolt clacking back into place. I stood in the entryway, chest heaving, still gripping my keys, looking at her pale face. She didn't say a word, just held onto me like she was making sure I was really there. Only then did I hear it, the faint sounds through the thin wall we shared with the next apartment. Heavy thuds like furniture being knocked over, then a muffled grunt, and then silence again. My wife pulled me away from the door, her hands shaking. I looked around our apartment, everything dim except the small lamp in the corner. The curtains were drawn tight, no windows open. She had locked everything down. I whispered, asking her what was happening, but she just shook her head quickly, as if speaking out loud might draw attention. Then I realized the source of all that blood. Our neighbor, the one who lived right next door, ran some kind of security business out of his place. Everyone knew him as tough, quiet, always dressed sharp. Rumors circled constantly that he had ties to gangs, maybe even Yakuza, though nobody ever dared to ask him directly. He always had strange people coming in and out, men who looked like they belonged in back rooms, not front offices. My wife pointed to the wall. That's when I heard it again, another thud, then a dragging sound, something heavy scraping across the floor next door. I stood frozen, listening. My mind pieced it together in fragments I didn't want to believe. Someone had attacked him, right there, just a few feet away through that thin wall. Later, I'd learned the whole story from whispers in the building, from police reports, from neighbors who couldn't stop talking about it. One of his employees had been fired earlier that week. Nobody thought much of it at the time, but apparently the man hadn't taken it well. He'd gone home, grabbed a massive kitchen knife, and come straight back, determined to settle it in blood. By the time I walked up those stairs, it had already happened. The attack, the wild, frenzied struggle that painted the stairwell and covered my door. The boss had tried to fight back, but the knife kept flashing, and there was nowhere to run in those narrow halls. The sounds I heard after being pulled inside weren't the attack itself, but the aftermath. The man was hacking his old boss to pieces, dismembering him right there on the floor of the apartment, as if rage alone was fueling him. We stayed locked inside, crouched low in the back room, barely breathing. Minutes crawled like hours. Every small creak in the wall made me flinch. At one point, the sound of footsteps echoed in the stairwell again, heavy and uneven. I thought he might come for us, maybe realizing someone had seen the blood. But the footsteps kept going, down and out, fading away. Much later, the flashing lights arrived. Police, paramedics, a whole flood of them storming the building. By then, my legs had gone numb from crouching, and my mouth was dry as sand. The officers knocked, and only then did we unlock the door again. The hallway was chaos, officers shouting, people being ushered outside, the smell of bleach already strong as cleaners prepared to scrub the walls. The man was gone by then. He didn't stay. He'd left the scene covered in blood, knife still in hand. They caught him hours later, hiding not far away, his clothes soaked and his mind gone blank. He didn't resist. They said he looked almost calm when they dragged him away. Standing in the hall that night, staring at the blood on my door, I felt something sink into me that never really left. That my home, my safe place, had been just inches away from becoming the site of a massacre. That if the man had decided differently, if he'd knocked on our door instead of going next door, My wife and I might have been the ones bleeding out on the floor. It took weeks for them to clean the stairwell completely, but I swear the smell lingered for longer. Even after fresh paint, you could still see faint outlines on the ceiling if you looked closely enough. The landlord tried to assure us everything was fine, but it wasn't. I couldn't shake the sound of those thuds, the dragging, the memory of my wife's terrified eye peeking through the letterbox. We lived there for a while after, but something had changed. Every time I walked up the stairs, my stomach twisted, my eyes drawn to the spot where the blood had once trickled down. Eventually we moved. We told people it was for work or for a bigger space, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't live in a place where I had seen so clearly how thin the line was between an ordinary day and complete horror. And even now, years later, when I walk alone at night, I sometimes catch myself staring too long at the ground, afraid I'll see that red line again, winding its way toward me. I lived in a townhouse-style apartment for a couple of years before I got married. At the time, it seemed like a good setup. The rent wasn't too bad, the place was newer compared to some of the other complexes in the area, and the layout was nice. There were 2 units stacked together, with mine and my roommate's place upstairs, and another unit directly below us. We shared a main entrance, which led into a small foyer with 2 doors, one leading upstairs to our apartment, and the other to the downstairs place. On paper it felt private enough, but the truth was the walls were thin, the ceilings carried sound, and anything that happened in one unit seemed to bleed right into the other. At first it was fine. My roommate and I were both in our mid-20s, both working, both kind of in that stage where you're half settled but half restless. We weren't looking to make lifelong friends with our neighbors, but we were polite enough. Downstairs, 2 guys lived there. I didn't know much about them, just that they seemed a little younger than us, maybe early 20s. They were easygoing, said hello in passing, and never caused any real problems. That changed gradually, in ways that seemed small at first. One of the guys downstairs got a girlfriend. She was around more and more, and eventually it seemed like she was living there full time. She had a baby with her, maybe just under a year old, and she brought along this little terrier dog. The lease specifically said no pets, but apparently that didn't matter much to her. The dog itself wasn't the issue. It was small and yappy, like a lot of terriers, but nothing unbearable. The problem was the mess. The entrance we shared was barely big enough for 2 people to pass each other without bumping shoulders. She'd let the dog run around in there, and it would leave little piles of poop right on the welcome mat or in the corner by the stairs. She never cleaned it. Not once. You'd be walking down the stairs to head out for work in the morning, and you'd have to stop and step around it, holding your breath. Sometimes it would sit there for days until my roommate or I finally caved and cleaned it up, even though it wasn't ours to deal with. The smell would hang in the air, sour and heavy, so the second you opened the front door it hit you in the face. That was just the beginning. When the other roommate downstairs eventually moved out, it was just the guy, his girlfriend, the baby, and the dog. That was when things really shifted. The guy seemed decent enough. Anytime I saw him outside or passing in the foyer, he was polite, quiet, even apologetic at times. He always looked a little embarrassed, like he knew his girlfriend's behavior was out of line, but didn't have the energy to argue with her. She, on the other hand, was something else entirely. The walls between our units were paper thin. At night, I could hear them fighting. It wasn't just a little bickering, it was full-on screaming matches that would last for hours. Her voice cut through the walls sharper than anything, high-pitched and relentless. Then the baby would start wailing, and it became this never-ending cycle of shouting and crying that made it impossible to relax. I'd sit on my couch upstairs with the TV turned up louder than normal, trying to drown it out, but even then it leaked through. During the day, when she was home alone with the baby, it wasn't much better. Any sound we made seemed to set her off. If a door closed too firmly, or if we walked down the stairs a little too fast, she'd come flying out of her door like a guard dog, snapping that we were going to wake the baby. She acted like the entire building was supposed to move in silence, just for her convenience. It didn't matter that babies cry for all kinds of reasons, or that she and her boyfriend screamed half the night. Everything in her eyes was our fault. I tried to ignore it as much as possible. I didn't want to get caught up in some neighbor war, especially since I could tell the guy was at least decent. He'd give a quick nod or a small smile if our paths crossed, almost like he was silently apologizing for her every time. But she carried herself like she owned the whole place, and the tension just grew. One night, it got so bad that I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her voice carrying through the floor. She was shrieking about something I couldn't make out. The baby was crying so hard it sounded like he couldn't catch his breath, and I remember thinking to myself, I have to get out of this place. It wasn't just about the noise. It was the constant stress of never knowing when the next outburst would come. The weeks turned into months, and by the time my roommate and I decided to move, I felt more relief than anything else. Packing up the apartment felt like counting down to freedom. Every box taped shut was a reminder that soon I wouldn't have to deal with the smell of dog crap in the foyer, or the sudden slamming of her door when she stormed out to yell at us for existing too loudly. The day we moved out was a Saturday. We started early, hauling furniture down the narrow staircase. It was sweaty, exhausting work, but I didn't care. I was so ready to be gone. Of course, nothing about that day went smoothly. While we were carrying the couch down, we misjudged the turn and bumped the wall pretty hard. The thud echoed through the stairwell. Before we could even adjust, her door flew open. She came out screaming. Not just annoyed, but furious, like we'd deliberately tried to ruin her day. Her voice filled the stairwell, cutting through the morning air, ranting about how we were going to wake the baby, how inconsiderate we were, how we didn't respect her home. We just stood there holding the couch, sweating, staring past her, because what could we even say? It was the same routine every time. We got the couch loaded into the truck, but the tension lingered. Even as we kept moving boxes and furniture, I could feel her eyes on us, hear her muttering under her breath through the thin door. It made the whole process more miserable than it already was. Parking was another nightmare that day. The complex had assigned spots, clearly marked, but she had this habit of parking in ours. Even on moving day, with our truck clearly sitting there, she left her car angled across the spot we needed. We had to squeeze around her vehicle, loading heavy furniture at awkward angles, all while she acted like she had every right to be there. By the time we finished, I was drained. Physically, mentally, emotionally, I just wanted to be done with it. I stood in the empty apartment, looking around at the bare walls and the carpet with its worn-out tracks where the furniture had been, and felt this wave of relief wash over me. Walking down the stairs one last time, past her door, I felt this strange mixture of anger and pity. Anger, because she had made what could have been a nice living situation into something tense and unbearable. Pity, because I couldn't help but feel bad for the guy downstairs. He seemed like a good person stuck in a bad situation, and now he was tied to her, the baby, the chaos, and all of it. He had that look in his eyes, every time I saw him, like he was trapped. When we pulled out of the lot with the last load in the truck, I looked back once at the building. The upstairs windows were empty now, no blinds or curtains left, just blank glass reflecting the sky. Downstairs, the blinds were drawn tight, but I could picture the scene inside. Her pacing, yelling about something, the baby crying, the dog scratching at the door. And him, probably just sitting there quiet, carrying the weight of it all. Driving away, I didn't feel scared exactly, but there was a heaviness in my chest. That place had started out as a fresh chapter, somewhere to live while I figured things out. But in the end, it had been overshadowed by their presence, their noise, their constant drama. I never went back to that complex. I never even drove past it again. But every so often I think about it. I think about the smell of that foyer, the sound of her voice cutting through the walls, the way the baby's cries seemed to fill every corner of that space. And I think about the guy, the one who always seemed pleasant, always seemed a little embarrassed, like he knew we were watching him drown, but he didn't know how to climb out. Leaving that apartment felt like closing the door on something toxic. I was glad to go, but the memory of it lingers, not like a ghost story, not like anything supernatural. Just the reality of how people can turn a place sour, how the walls of a home can carry more than just sound. In the end, the apartment itself was fine. It was the people who made it unbearable. And walking away from it, I knew I'd carry that lesson with me. Sometimes it's not the walls or the rent or the square footage that matters. It's who's on the other side of the wall. That day, with the truck loaded and the keys handed in, I felt lighter than I had in months. The noise, the smell, the fights, they weren't mine to deal with anymore. For the first time in a long time, the silence was mine again. When I first moved into that apartment, I didn't think much about who my neighbors were going to be. I had been looking for a place close enough to school, so I wouldn't have to waste hours commuting, and this apartment fit the budget. It wasn't perfect. The walls were thin, the carpet was old, and the hallway always smelled faintly like cigarettes and something fried in too much oil. But I had lived in worse places before, so I figured I could handle it. My apartment was on the second floor of the building. There were 2 units on each side of the hallway. Across from me was a quiet older man who I barely ever saw. On one side of me, there was a young couple who argued constantly, and on the other side, there was the woman who, at the time, I only knew in passing. She was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, with 3 little kids. At first, I thought she was just another tenant trying to get by like everyone else. She introduced herself not long after I moved in. She knocked on my door one evening with a plate of cookies and one of her kids clinging to her leg. She seemed friendly, maybe a little too eager to have someone to talk to. She said she was a single mom, raising her 3 kids alone, and it was hard. I felt sorry for her at first. I wasn't used to having neighbors who wanted to chat, but I figured a little friendliness wouldn't hurt. Over the next couple of weeks, she made a habit of stopping me in the hallway or inviting me over for a drink. Sometimes I went, sometimes I didn't, depending on how tired I was after school or work. The first few times weren't bad. We'd sit in her living room, talk about random things, sip a couple beers, and then I'd head home. I noticed her apartment was messy, clothes everywhere, dishes piled up, toys scattered on the floor, but I didn't think too much about it. She had 3 little kids, and I figured that was just part of her life. Then one night she asked if I could do her a favor. She said she needed to run out for an hour, and asked if I could watch her kids. I didn't really see the harm in it. I liked kids, and it didn't sound like a big deal. She had an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. They were all sweet kids, a little shy at first, but they warmed up quickly. I got them ready for bed, read them a story, and put them to sleep. But that 1 hour turned into 4. By the time she stumbled back in, she was so drunk she could barely stand. She mumbled something about being sorry, waved her hand like it didn't matter, and went straight to her room. She didn't even pay me, though she had promised she would. At the time, I brushed it off. I didn't want to make a big deal about it. The kids were fine, and I figured it was just one night. It wasn't. That first time turned into a regular thing. Every week, sometimes multiple times a week, she'd knock on my door or catch me in the hallway, shove her kids toward me, and disappear for hours. She never told me where she was going. Sometimes she came back sloppy drunk. Sometimes she didn't show up until morning. I got sick of it quickly. I hadn't signed up to be a babysitter, especially not for free, and I definitely hadn't signed up to cover for someone who clearly didn't care what kind of danger she was putting her kids in. I started ignoring her knocks on my door. I pretended I wasn't home. I kept my headphones in when I walked past her. I figured if I cut her off, she'd get the hint. But she didn't. A couple of weeks later, I came home from class and saw her hosting a party in the hallway. Literally in the hallway. Music blasting, people sitting on the floor, smoking, drinking. I tried to slip past without getting noticed, but she saw me and waved me over. Against my better judgment, I stopped. I thought, fine, I'll have a quick drink and then leave. Inside her apartment, things were worse than I had realized. It reeked of stale beer, cigarettes, and dirty diapers. Trash was piled up in corners, the sink was overflowing with dishes, and there was a stain on the carpet that looked like it had been there for weeks. Still, I stayed for a bit, just to be polite. After a couple of hours, most of the people had either passed out or left. She was still going, though. She was snorting pills and pouring shots with her infant in her arms. At one point, she vomited all over the floor while holding the baby. She almost dropped her. I rushed forward, took the baby from her arms, and tried to wake her up, but she was completely gone. The other 2 kids were standing in the doorway, looking terrified. I cleaned up what I could, made the kids some food, and put them to bed. Then I went home. That night stuck with me. I couldn't shake the image of her dropping her baby, or the way her kids looked at her, scared and confused, too young to understand but old enough to know something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, it kept happening. She'd leave the kids alone for hours at a time. They started knocking on my door when they were hungry or scared. I always let them in, gave them something to eat, let them watch TV until they calmed down. But I was getting angry. It wasn't my responsibility to keep them safe. One night, after the kids had been sitting in my living room for almost 3 hours, I snapped. I gave her 15 minutes to come home, or I was calling CPS. She finally showed up, barely able to walk straight, and took the kids home. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Not long after, my roommate texted me while I was at school. He said she had busted into our apartment, thinking no one was home. But he was there, and he caught her. He made her leave, but a couple of days later I realized $100 was missing from my drawer. Some of my change was gone too, and even a pair of heels I had barely worn. I didn't have proof, but I knew it was her. I had tried to be patient, tried to help, but that was it for me. The last straw came the night she left her kids alone again, this time for hours. When we finally checked on them, the older two had tried to cook something, and there was broken glass all over the floor. The baby's diaper was so old it was practically stuck to her. It was clear she had been left alone far too often. My roommate called CPS and the police. The police showed up fast, and when they saw the state of the kids and the apartment, they were furious. They took our statements, asked us to describe everything we had seen over the past few months, and waited for her to come home. I sat there shaking, telling them everything. Every time she had dumped her kids on me, every time they had come to my door hungry, every time I had seen her too drunk to stand while holding her baby. She finally showed up after they contacted the kid's father. I watched from my window as she staggered up the sidewalk, screaming at the officers. When they tried to talk to her, she got violent. They slammed her against the car and cuffed her right there in front of everyone. One of the officers came back upstairs and told me that she had tried to say I was supposed to be watching the kids. She wanted me to lie for her, to cover for her neglect. I told them the truth. I wasn't going to risk those kids' safety just to protect someone who clearly didn't care about them. It turned out she already had child neglect charges and even a theft charge on her record. They took her to jail that night, and she's been there ever since. Her kids went to live with their grandparents, and from what I've heard, they're doing much better. After she was gone, the building felt different, quieter, safer. I didn't realize how much stress she had caused me until she wasn't around anymore. I could walk down the hallway without feeling tense, without wondering if her kids would be standing at my door scared and hungry, without wondering if she'd try to drag me into her chaos again. It took months for me to stop expecting a knock at my door late at night, for me to stop jumping every time I heard shouting in the hallway. But slowly, the tension faded. In the end, I was just glad the kids were safe. That was what mattered most. They didn't deserve the life they had been living in that apartment, and if telling the truth meant their mother went to jail, then so be it. They had a chance now, a chance to be cared for, to grow up in a home where they didn't have to beg strangers for food or hide from their mother's drunken rages. And for me, it was a lesson I won't ever forget. Not all nightmares come from ghosts or shadows in the dark. Sometimes they live right next door, wearing a smile, knocking on your door with cookies, and slowly pulling you into something you never signed up for. When I say my neighbor is awful, I don't mean in the normal sense of someone who's just grumpy or keeps their yard messy. I mean awful in a way that makes my stomach tighten every time I look out my window and see his house, sitting less than 150 feet away. It bothers me even to be writing this while knowing he's right there, close enough that if he decided to, he could walk up to my door in less than a minute. For the sake of telling this, I'll call him Wooden Eye, because of the lazy eye that never quite looks where it should. But the eye is only one piece of the story. The rest of him is what really unsettles me. From the start, he was the kind of person who seemed to feed off conflict. He would sue people for anything he thought he could get money out of. I don't mean big, serious cases. I mean little things. Petty things. He'd twist words, bend stories, and find loopholes in whatever way he could. He once put his house up for rent, and when the renters complained that it smelled like cigarette smoke, he turned around and sued them for smoking in a non-smoking house. The irony was enough to choke on, since anyone within 50 feet of his porch could tell you he was a heavy smoker himself. You could smell it drifting across the property lines every time the wind shifted. His house wasn't just smoked in, it was stained by smoke, curtains, furniture, walls, everything. Yet he still had the audacity to accuse others of what he had been doing for years. The lawsuits were just the start. Wooden Eye had a habit of roping people into things. Pyramid schemes were his favorite, and he'd approach you with this crooked grin and a half-sincere pitch about how you could change your life if you just invested a little money here, a little money there. He tried it on us more than once. Each time, we politely backed out, but I could see it annoyed him. His face would tighten, and that wandering eye of his would shift in this weird way, like it was trying to focus on something you couldn't see. He'd mutter about how people never wanted to help themselves, how they stayed stuck in the same place because they didn't take opportunities. It always left me with a sour feeling. Then there were his animals. He had dogs, one after another. None of them stayed long. They didn't run away because they were adventurous. They ran because he neglected them. I'd see them chained up outside, no shelter during storms, no food bowls in sight. They'd sit out there shivering, ribs showing, barking into the emptiness while he sat inside chain smoking. Eventually, they'd get loose and disappear, and he wouldn't bother looking for them. I never once saw him show any affection to any of them. Just the sight of those poor animals, thin and desperate, would make me angry in a way I can't even describe. And then came the thing that really set the neighborhood against him. One of my other neighbors had a cat that slipped into Wooden Eye's yard. A harmless little thing, not doing anything, just curious. Wooden Eye shot it. He didn't hesitate, didn't try to return it, didn't shoo it away, just shot it dead. That was the moment I think most of us realized there was no line he wouldn't cross. Everyone whispered about it, but no one really confronted him directly. You didn't want to. He had that kind of presence that made you think twice before saying the wrong thing. There was something unpredictable about him, like he was always half a step away from snapping. My mother used to work at a flea market, and that's where she learned more about him than I think I ever wanted to know. People told her how Wooden Eye would show up with food boxes from free pantries, food meant for homeless people, people who had nothing, and sell it at the flea market like it was just another product. That was who he was, taking from those who already had nothing and finding a way to make $1 off of it. I think that told me more about his character than anything else ever could. It was low, it was dirty, and it was heartless. But to him, it was just another hustle. Recently, he lost his driver's license. Probably no surprise there, since he smoked and drank constantly and always seemed just a little out of it when he talked. Since then, he's been trying to lean on neighbors for rides. Every so often he'd ask us. Every time we were busy. Not because we actually were, but because the idea of being trapped in a car with him, even for a short drive, made me uneasy in a way I can't fully explain. Just the thought of being confined in a space that small with him made my skin crawl. I'd rather make up excuses than put myself in that position. The thing about Wooden Eye is that all of this, the lawsuits, the animals, the cat, the scams, the food, it builds this picture of a man who's not just unpleasant, but dangerous. Dangerous in a quiet, creeping way. Not the kind of danger that bursts in with sirens and flashing lights, but the kind that festers just beneath the surface. You start to notice how his house looks different from everyone else's. The blinds are always half drawn, never fully open. The yard is patchy, neglected, with broken items scattered around like he can't be bothered to clean anything up. His porch is littered with cigarette butts, overflowing ashtrays, and the faint smell of stale beer. He sits out there sometimes, just staring, not even pretending to be doing anything else. Staring at whoever happens to be outside, that lazy eye drifting one way while the other fixes on you. It makes your chest tighten, being watched like that. At night, it's worse. His windows glow faintly, the smoke trapped inside making everything look hazy from the outside. Sometimes I'll catch sight of him moving around, a shadow passing behind the curtains. I can't explain why it unnerves me so much, but it does. The idea that he's there, only a short walk away, sitting in that smoke-filled cave of a house. Sometimes I lie awake and wonder what he's doing in there, what he's capable of. The thought that he could be outside, walking the property line in the dark, crosses my mind more often than I want to admit. And every time I look out, I half expect to see him standing there, just far enough away that I can't see his expression, but close enough that I'd know he was watching. There's something about living this close to someone like that changes the way you move through your own home. I keep my blinds closed more than I used to. I step a little quicker when I take the trash out at night. I check the locks on the doors more often than is probably necessary. Because when you have someone like Wooden Eye living only 150 feet away, you realize that all it takes is one bad day, one bad thought, one impulsive decision, and he could decide to make you his next problem. He's shown time and time again that he has no problem hurting animals, exploiting people, twisting situations for his own gain. Why would he stop there? Why would he draw a line at me or my family? The worst part is that there's no dramatic moment to point to, no single thing that makes me feel unsafe around him. It's everything combined, the history, the way he looks at people, the way he treats life in general. It's a steady, constant pressure that never goes away. Living next to him feels like living next to a storm that hasn't broken yet. You can see the clouds building, you can feel the air getting heavier, but you don't know when or if the lightning will strike. And so you wait day after day, knowing he's there, knowing what he's capable of, and wondering how much longer until something gives. That's the real fear. Not a ghost, not some made-up monster, but a man. A real man with real cruelty in him, living less than 150 feet away from me. Every day I see his house, I'm reminded of it. Every time I step outside, I think about it. I don't have to imagine danger. It's right there, in the form of a neighbor with a lazy eye and a long trail of ugly choices behind him. And until he's gone, until something finally removes him from this place, I'll keep living with that knot in my stomach, knowing that the worst thing in my life isn't some far-off nightmare. It's a man with a cigarette in his hand and a history of doing harm, sitting on his porch just across the way. That's the ending. Not a bang, not a scream, not a flash of horror, just the heavy weight of knowing the threat is real, constant, and uncomfortably close. I used to live in a neighborhood that, at first glance, looked normal enough. Middle-class homes lined the street, each one with small yards, worn fences, and patches of grass that all showed some level of neglect. You'd see kids riding their bikes in circles in the evening, men washing their cars in driveways, women standing in front yards pulling weeds. It looked average, maybe even boring. But my next-door neighbors at the time made it a nightmare. It started with trash. I didn't notice it much at first. One day I went out to the shed at the back of my yard, planning to pull out some tools, and I found a plastic grocery bag crumpled up against the side of it. Inside the bag were paper plates smeared with dried spaghetti sauce, a half-eaten sandwich, and some soda cans. I thought maybe it had blown over the fence with the wind. People left their cans out all the time, and trash blew around the street. I tossed it out without thinking much of it, but then I started seeing more. Every few days, new things appeared in my yard that didn't belong to me. A crushed box of cereal, candy wrappers, empty soda bottles, broken toys. Sometimes they were scattered by the shed, other times by the fence line. At first, I tried convincing myself it was just wind, maybe raccoons dragging garbage around at night. But one morning I stepped outside early, and I saw it happen. The neighbor's back door opened, and one of them tossed a small white bag right over their fence into my grass, like it was the most casual thing in the world. I froze, watching the bag land a few feet from my shed. It split open when it hit, and I could see inside. It was filled with used diapers. I felt sick, not just from the smell, but from the sheer disrespect of it. They had their own garbage bins like everyone else. The truck came every Thursday. They had no reason to do that other than sheer laziness and spite. I thought about confronting them, but I didn't want the headache. People like that don't change. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started throwing their trash back. I picked it up, walked it over, and flung it back over the fence. For a while it felt satisfying. They'd throw something, I'd return it like I was making a point. But the satisfaction didn't last, because no matter how much I sent back, it kept coming. Every time I went out to the shed in the summer, there was something new. A ripped, open stuffed animal with the stuffing spilling out. Rusty soda cans with sharp edges. Plastic bags full of rotting food. Sometimes even diapers again. I couldn't believe it. It felt endless. It wasn't just the trash either. The son was older, maybe 17 or 18, and he was always in their driveway working on his car. Every single day, the same scene. Hood propped open, tools spread across the ground, greasy rags everywhere. He blasted music so loud the bass rattled my windows, and he stayed out there for hours. I'd mow my lawn and hear it thumping the whole time, pounding in my ears. Even when I went inside, I could still hear it faintly through the walls. And then there was the basketball hoop. They had one in their driveway for years, and he and his friends used to play late into the night. The sound of the ball bouncing on the concrete over and over would echo down the block. Eventually, they stopped using it. The hoop disappeared one day, and I thought maybe they got rid of it. But then I found it, dumped in my yard. The whole backboard and hoop leaned against my fence one morning like they thought I'd be too blind to notice. I dragged it back into their yard, shoved it against the same fence they threw trash over, and left it there. I thought that would be the end of it. But the next day it was back. I didn't even hear them move it, but there it was, heavy and awkward, sitting on my grass like it belonged to me. I shoved it back again, and again it came back. It was like some sick game, and they always won because I was the only one dealing with it. I started feeling like my yard wasn't even mine anymore. Every time I walked outside, I half expected to find something new waiting for me. And I always did. Trash, broken junk, whatever they didn't want anymore. I stopped inviting friends over. I stopped grilling out in the backyard because I didn't want to sit there surrounded by their garbage. I hated going out to the shed because I never knew what disgusting surprise I'd find by the door. It wore me down. It wasn't just trash, it was control. They were marking their presence on my space, reminding me that they didn't care, that they could do whatever they wanted. I started resenting them in ways I didn't even think were possible. Then one night I couldn't sleep. The music had been blasting for hours again, and it was past midnight. I looked out the window and saw the son under the hood of his car, shirtless, sweat running down his back, music shaking the whole street. His friends were there too, drinking beers, tossing the bottles into the grass by their driveway. I watched them laugh and yell, and then I saw one of them walk to the back fence with a bag in his hand. Without hesitation, he flung it into my yard. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked outside barefoot, grabbed the bag, and hurled it right back over, harder than I should have. I heard it smack against something on their side, maybe even one of them, but I didn't care. I went back inside and sat by the window waiting. I half expected them to come banging on my door, but they didn't. Instead, I saw them laughing, pointing at my house. From then on, it escalated. The trash became almost daily. Not just food and wrappers, but random, unsettling things. A shredded teddy bear, a half-empty bottle of motor oil, a single muddy work boot, a broken chair leg. It was always just enough to make me uneasy. I started wondering if they were doing it on purpose, to mess with me. It felt deliberate, like they wanted to see how far they could push me before I snapped. Summer dragged on like that. My yard was never clean. My patience was gone. I fantasized about calling the cops, but I knew it would only make things worse. People like that don't stop, they retaliate. I kept my head down, fought my little battles, and told myself it wouldn't last forever. Then, just as suddenly as it all started, it ended. One morning I woke up, and their driveway was empty. No car, no tools, no music. Their windows were dark. The trash stopped. Days passed, and still nothing. I finally realized they had moved. Just like that. It was like someone had flipped a switch. My yard stayed clean. The basketball hoop never came back. The nights were quiet. I could walk out to the shed without finding bags of rotting food or broken junk waiting for me. It felt like I could breathe again. And yet, the relief was mixed with something else, an uneasy heaviness that didn't leave right away. After months of being harassed in my own yard, I had gotten used to expecting it. Every morning, I'd look out the back window, bracing myself for what I might see. Even when there was nothing there, my stomach stayed tight until I checked. Eventually that faded too. The grass grew back where the hoop had been dragged across it, the fence line cleared, and the shed area stayed clean. My space was mine again. Looking back now, I still think of them as the neighbors from hell. They poisoned my summer with their constant disrespect. But the strangest part is, after they left, the silence felt almost unnatural at first. Like I had been living in chaos for so long that I didn't know how to relax when it was finally gone. But with time I did. And when I finally sat outside one evening, grilling food without a pile of trash behind me, without music shaking the air, without watching over my shoulder for what they'd throw next, I realized how heavy it had been. The day they moved was the day I got my life back, and I didn't miss them for a second. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place that most people only hear about on the news or drive through quickly with their windows rolled up. To me, though, it was just home. When you're a kid, you don't really think about how dangerous or broken your surroundings are. You just get used to it, the way you get used to the cracks in the sidewalk or the sound of dogs barking all night. But as I got older, I started realizing just how different my neighborhood was from the places where other kids lived. One thing about neighborhoods like mine is that everyone falls into a category. You have the ghost neighbors, the ones who barely exist. You'll see their lights on at night, but you'll never see them step outside, never hear them say hello. You might not even know their names. Then you have the neighbors from hell, the loud ones, the violent ones, the ones you dread running into, because they'll drag you into their chaos whether you want to be there or not. And then almost surprisingly, you have the good ones, the neighbors you cling to because in a place like that, you need allies. The house I grew up in was wedged between two decent neighbors. On one side, we had one of those ghost neighbors who eventually warmed up to us. For years, we hardly exchanged a word, but one day he just started talking. After that, he was actually a nice guy. On the other side were my godparents. They weren't just neighbors, they were family. In a place where trust was rare, that meant everything. But across the street, things were very different. Directly across was a family of meth addicts, the kind of people who always seemed to be in the middle of a meltdown. The house was falling apart, the yard overgrown, and there was a steady flow of shady people coming and going at all hours. 2 doors down from them, right on the corner, lived a man who changed the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. His name was Dan, though most people didn't call him that. He went by a lot of nicknames: Tweaker Dan, the white guy, sometimes just that crazy motherfucker. He wasn't just another meth head. Dan was an icon, a figure that everyone in the neighborhood knew about whether they wanted to or not. Dan had a makeshift auto shop crammed into his garage. He worked on cars from early morning, sometimes before the sun came up, until late at night, banging, clanging, cursing, and revving engines so loud the whole street shook. People were constantly stopping by. Some came for drugs, some for car work, some just to hang around. His place was like a magnet for trouble, and yet, somehow, the trouble rarely spilled out too far beyond his reach. Gunshots weren't uncommon around Dan's place. Sometimes an argument would break out, and people would start yelling outside, and suddenly you'd hear gunfire. It wasn't every night, but it was often enough that I remember lying awake, listening, wondering if a stray bullet would come through the wall of our house. Most of the time, though, people backed down as soon as Dan reached for his gun. He didn't seem to hesitate, and everyone knew it. What always struck me was that Dan had a car that worked just fine, but he almost always rode a bike. A grown man, middle-aged, pedaling around on a beat-up bicycle with no shirt, waving at people as he passed. When I was a kid, I thought it was funny, almost pathetic. As I got older, I realized it wasn't random at all. Dan waved at everyone, every single person. At first, I thought he was just trying to look friendly, like some weird neighborhood mascot. But it was more than that. Dan was watching. He wanted to see who belonged, who didn't. If he waved at you and you waved back, he knew you lived there. He kept track of faces, of cars, of routines. It was subtle, but it was constant. Back then, I only knew him as the loud, crazy neighbor who never slept. But later, I learned from people I knew, mutual friends, people who drifted in and out of his orbit, that Dan was much more than that. He wasn't just some small-time dealer. Dan controlled a big chunk of the local supply chain. The area we lived in was caught between 2 major gangs. Both were big, powerful, violent. Normally, a neighborhood like ours would have been swallowed whole by one of them. But they didn't move in because of Dan. He had an arrangement. He was their supplier. They called him the white guy, and he sold to them, but with strict rules. They kept their business out of his neighborhood. He would sell to pretty much anyone, but if you wanted to keep buying from him, you didn't bring gang activity onto his street. That bike he rode everywhere wasn't just for exercise or because he was broke. It was part of his surveillance. He circled the neighborhood, keeping tabs, making sure the rules were followed. His wave wasn't just friendliness, it was a warning. It meant, I see you. I know you're here. The thing is, most of us had no idea at the time. We just saw his erratic behavior, his strange schedule, the constant noise. We saw him strung out, tweaking, and figured he was just another dangerous addict. But the truth was, he was also keeping a kind of order, a brutal, twisted order, but order nonetheless. It was always strange to see who was on good terms with him. Some of the cleanest houses on the block, the ones you'd think would be against him, were friendly with him. The prison guard, who lived a few doors down. My godfather. Even some families with kids. People you'd expect to steer clear of him were instead nodding at him, chatting, sometimes even having a beer with him in their driveway. They knew. Somehow they all knew. Not the full details, maybe, but enough. They knew that Dan wasn't just chaos. He was a line of defense, in his own way. I didn't really understand that until I asked my godfather years later. He just shrugged and said he knew, but it wasn't something you talked about. Looking back, I realized Dan was one of the best and worst neighbors I ever had. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and he scared the shit out of me more than once. But at the same time, he was the reason our street didn't completely collapse under the weight of gang wars and constant violence. He was the reason certain people stayed away, why things didn't get even worse. Living there, you didn't think about how fragile it all was. As a kid, I thought the neighborhood was just tough, that it was what it was. As an adult, I see how much of it balanced on the shoulders of one unstable man who rode his bike in circles, waving at everyone, making sure his little kingdom stayed intact. Dan eventually disappeared. I don't know if he got arrested, or if he overdosed, or if someone finally caught up to him. One day he was just gone. No more revving engines, no more bike, no more waves. And slowly, the neighborhood started to change. Without him, the gangs crept closer. There were more fights, more trouble, more fear. The fragile bubble he had created popped, and reality came pouring in. When I think about my childhood home now, I don't just remember the bad. I remember the safety of knowing my godparents were next door, the strange comfort of seeing Dan ride past on his bike, the sense that, even in a broken place, there were still rules, even if they weren't the kind you'd find written down anywhere. Dan wasn't a hero. He wasn't someone you'd want to look up to. He ruined lives, dealt poison, and scared people. But he was also the reason we weren't swallowed whole. He was a wall, a loud, cracked, dangerous wall, but a wall all the same. And that's why I'll never forget him. Because in that neighborhood, in that time, he was both the best and the worst neighbor I ever had.